In the hushed folds of the Hudson River Valley, tucked away from the hurried pulse of the world beyond, there lies a little village the locals call Sleepy Hollow. It is not the sort of place that loudly declares its presence on a map. In truth, it seems more a secret than a settlement, hidden in a pocket of land where time itself drifts in a slower current. The road that leads there bends and twists as if reluctant to reveal the hollow too soon, and when you finally arrive, there is an almost imperceptible shift in the air. The breeze feels older somehow, steeped in memory, carrying with it a faint fragrance of damp leaves and wood smoke, as though the very atmosphere remembers centuries gone by. To outsiders, Sleepy Hollow appears quaint, even idyllic. Its meadows are green and gentle. Its old Dutch houses sit beneath drooping willows and towering elms. And the church steeple, pale against the backdrop of the woods, keeps silent watch over the valley. Yet beneath this peaceful surface runs something deeper, older, and more unsettling. The place seems touched by an enchantment, not a kind whimsical magic, but something strange and brooding. The locals themselves are quiet folk, but if you speak with them in the dim light of a tavern or at the edge of a fading day, their tongues loosen, and they will tell you tales that are not meant to travel beyond the hollow. They speak of shadows that move with minds of their own, of strange lights flickering in the forest when the moon is thin, and of footsteps heard in the dead of night on empty roads. And inevitably, their voices drop lower when they speak of the most feared figure of all, the Headless Horseman. They say he was once a Hessian soldier during the days of the Revolutionary War, a man of fierce skill on horseback who fell in battle when a cannonball struck him down, taking his head clean from his shoulders. His body was buried in the small churchyard at the edge of the hollow, but his head was never found. Ever since, his restless spirit is said to rise from the grave on certain nights, galloping through the valley in a desperate search for the head he lost. No mortal has ever stood in his way and come away unchanged. Some tell of seeing him streak past under the silver light of the moon, a dark figure upon a massive black horse, the wind howling in his wake, his missing head carried before him like a grim lantern. Others speak of hearing the pounding of hooves in the fog, only for the sound to stop abruptly, as if swallowed by the night itself. To the people of Sleepy Hollow, this legend is not merely a fireside amusement. It is a truth woven into the very soil beneath their feet. Children grow up warned not to linger near the churchyard after dark, and even the bravest men avoid certain roads when the night is moonless. Outsiders might laugh, might dismiss it all as superstition, but in the hollow, no one truly laughs about the horseman. The moment his name is spoken, eyes flicker to the shadows, and the conversation changes. It is as though his presence is never entirely absent, waiting just beyond the reach of the lamplight. It was into this strange, secluded world that a certain lanky, awkward schoolteacher arrived one autumn many years ago. He came from Connecticut, traveling by horseback along the winding roads that led him deeper into the Hudson Valley. His journey took him through thickets of russet and gold, the trees heavy with the last leaves of the season, their branches arching overhead to form long, shadowed tunnels. Each step of his horse seemed to carry him further from the noise and familiarity of the larger towns and into a place where the landscape itself seemed to be watching. When he first glimpsed Sleepy Hollow, it was in the late afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long slants of light across the fields, while a pale mist was beginning to gather at the edges of the woods. The village seemed drowsy, as though caught in some pleasant dream. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the distant toll of the church bell drifted on the wind. There was a stillness here unlike any he had known, not the stillness of emptiness, but of something ancient and deliberate, as if the land was listening. He soon discovered that the schoolhouse, a small, weathered building at the edge of the village, would be his home and place of work. It stood near a cluster of trees whose branches swayed with slow, creaking motions, even when the air was still. His days began in the crisp, pale light of morning, with the chatter of children and the smell of wood smoke in the air. The work was simple enough, but in the quiet hours between lessons, he found his mind wandering. He would gaze out the windows at the dark tree line and wonder what secrets it kept. It was not long before he began to hear the stories. At first, they came in harmless fragments. A child casually mentioning that a neighbor had seen a ghostly rider on the road, or an old farmer warning him not to travel near the churchyard after sundown. But as the weeks passed, the tales grew richer, more detailed, and more unsettling. On cool evenings, when the shadows pooled in the corners of the tavern and the candlelight flickered, the older villagers would speak in low voices of the Headless Horseman. They told of encounters in the mists, of riders who vanished before the eyes of witnesses, of sudden bursts of wind and the chilling sound of hooves behind you when the road ahead was empty. The schoolteacher listened with an eager, almost guilty fascination. There was something intoxicating about these stories, something that made the hollow feel both thrilling and dangerous. Yet in the quiet of his own room, with only the wind scratching at the shutters, he sometimes regretted hearing them. He could not shake the image of the horseman, a towering figure cloaked in darkness, his horse's breath steaming in the cold night, his missing head a pale, grinning thing cradled under one arm. Autumn deepened, and with it came a sharper bite to the air. The leaves turned to flames of crimson and gold before tumbling into the roads, and a thin veil of fog began to rise from the ground each evening. The hollow at night was a place transformed. The familiar houses became dim shapes, the trees loomed higher and darker, and the paths seemed to twist in ways they did not during the day. Every creak of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush took on a weight it did not have in daylight. He began to notice other things, small at first, but enough to stir unease. Once, walking home from the tavern at dusk, he thought he saw a shadow detach itself from the tree line and drift silently across the road ahead. Another time, while crossing the bridge near the churchyard, he heard the faint sound of hooves on the far side. But when he looked, the road was empty and still. The villagers, when he mentioned these moments, would only nod knowingly, as though such things needed no explanation. The more he heard, the more the legend grew in his mind, until it felt almost alive, breathing in the dark corners of his thoughts. He tried to laugh at himself, to remind himself that he was a man of reason, but in Sleepy Hollow, reason seemed to lose some of its footing. The air was too heavy with stories, the nights too full of watchful silence. And always, somewhere at the edge of his awareness, was the sense that the horseman's restless search might one day cross his own path. The days in Sleepy Hollow grew shorter, and the nights stretched longer, as though the valley itself was reluctant to let the sun linger. The crisp edge of autumn sharpened into cold, and with it came an unsettling change in the air. The mist that once only clung to the edges of the fields now rose thick and pale, swallowing the paths entirely. The trees, stripped of their leaves, stood like dark, skeletal sentinels along the roads, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. Even the river seemed slower, its surface often shrouded in a silver haze that mirrored the moonlight. The schoolteacher felt the change in his bones. There were moments, standing alone outside the schoolhouse, when he sensed that the silence was not empty, but waiting. The wind that rustled the dead leaves sometimes carried with it the faintest sound of distant hoofbeats, so soft they might have been his imagination, and yet so steady that they seemed to come from something purposeful, something drawing nearer. He tried to tell himself that it was merely the sound of a farmer's horse on the far road, but the unease lingered. On certain evenings, the tavern became a gathering place for those unwilling to walk the Hollow's roads alone. The older men, with faces weathered by years and eyes half hidden under the brims of their hats, would huddle close to the fire and tell tales that grew darker with each retelling. They spoke of hunters losing their way in the fog and never returning, of travelers who heard galloping behind them only to turn and find the road empty, of strange lights moving along the ridge of the hills that no living man could follow. Always, these stories circled back to the Headless Horseman. They described the smell of damp earth and gunpowder in the air when he passed, the thunder of his horse's hooves, and the gleam of his head, pale as bone, cradled in the crook of his arm. Some swore he was bound to ride only at night, others that he could appear whenever the sky was gray and the air heavy. Though the schoolteacher smiled and nodded, pretending to take the stories lightly, each one burrowed deeper into his mind. He began to avoid certain paths after dark. He quickened his step when passing the churchyard. He even found himself glancing over his shoulder when crossing the old wooden bridge, as though expecting some unseen rider to be there in the mist. It was during one such evening walk that he first noticed the figure. The road was dim, the light of day almost gone, and the fog was beginning to rise. The trees closed in tightly here, and the air smelled of damp earth. As he approached a bend, he thought he saw movement just ahead, a shadow that did not belong to any tree or fence. It was tall, broad at the shoulders, and still. His first instinct was to call out, but his voice caught in his throat. He blinked, and the shape was gone, swallowed by the mist. A moment later, the faint sound of hoofbeats drifted through the air, steady and slow, before fading into silence. He told himself it was nothing, that the fog played tricks on the eyes, but his pace quickened all the same. That night, sleep did not come easily. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of the wind against the shutters made him start awake. When dreams did claim him, they were filled with the pounding of hooves and a looming figure that moved without a head, its cloak whipping in the wind. As the weeks passed, such moments grew more frequent. Once, while crossing the far field at dusk, he caught sight of what looked like a rider moving between the trees, a dark form that seemed unnaturally swift. By the time he reached the road, the figure was gone, leaving only a faint trail of disturbed leaves. Another time, he awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of a horse neighing somewhere nearby, though no one in the village kept their animals so close to his small home. He lay still, listening, and heard the slow, deliberate clop of hooves pass outside before fading into the night. The villagers began to watch him with a kind of knowing sympathy. They said little, but their silence carried weight. It was as if they understood that the hollow had begun to take hold of him, the way it did with all who stayed too long. The stories were no longer just tales told by the fire. They had begun to bleed into his reality. The boundaries between what was real and what was imagined grew thinner with each passing day. The first snowfall came early that year. It fell in heavy, wet flakes that muffled the sound of the village and blanketed the woods in white. For a brief time, the snow seemed to push back the shadows, making the hollow appear gentler, even harmless. But winter in Sleepy Hollow had its own ghosts. The snow muffled footsteps and swallowed sound, and the long nights were deeper and darker than ever. In this silence, the faintest noises, a creak, a sigh of wind, took on the weight of something approaching. It was on one of these nights, with the snow lying thick on the ground, that the schoolteacher felt the hollow watching him most closely. He had lingered at the tavern later than usual, hoping the warmth and company would chase away the unease that clung to him. But as he stepped outside, the village lay silent under a thin silver moon. His breath clouded the air as he made his way down the road, the snow crunching softly underfoot. Halfway to the bridge, he paused. The night was still, too still. Then, faintly at first, he heard it. The steady, rhythmic pounding of hooves on the snow. It was not the hurried trot of a farmer's horse or the playful gallop of a young rider. This was measured, relentless, and coming closer. He turned, but the road behind him lay empty, the moonlight stretching across it in pale ribbons. The sound grew louder, filling the cold air until it seemed to echo inside his chest. Panic rose in him, urging him to run, but his legs felt heavy, bound by some unseen weight. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, thick, expectant, as though the night itself was holding its breath. He did not wait to see what might follow. He hurried across the bridge and up the path to his home, not daring to look back. That night, even under the safety of his own roof, he felt as though something was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The winter deepened in Sleepy Hollow, and the days seemed made of more shadow than light. Even the brief hours of sun felt weak, as if the pale rays could not quite pierce the valley's quiet gloom. The snow along the roads turned hard and crusted, crunching sharply underfoot. At night, the world seemed made of nothing but frost, silence, and the long, empty stretch of dark between one lamp's glow and the next. In this season, the hollow's ghost stories grew stronger, as though the cold stripped away the thin veil between the living and the dead. The fireside gatherings became smaller, more private. The tales told now were not for amusement. They were told with the seriousness of warnings. More than once, the horseman's name was spoken in a low voice, followed by uneasy glances toward the window. The old belief was that the horseman's presence was strongest in winter, when the cold nights kept mortal souls indoors and left the roads free for him to ride. The schoolteacher could not shake the sound he had heard that snowy night, the relentless pounding of hooves that had stopped as if on command. He found himself listening for it on every walk, straining his ears in the heavy quiet. Once, in the pale light of dawn, he thought he saw tracks in the snow, not fresh enough to be clear, yet unlike any left by the village horses. They were deeper, as though made by something heavier, and they led away from the churchyard into the dense woods. He stood staring at them far longer than he meant to, until the cold forced him to move on. The more he tried to reason away what he had heard and seen, the more the hollow seemed to conspire against him. The wind would rise suddenly, carrying the faint metallic tang of gunpowder. A shadow would flicker across the road without any living thing to cast it. The faint scent of damp earth would drift past him even in the frozen air. And always, Somewhere at the edge of hearing, there was the imagined, or perhaps real, thud of distant hooves. One evening, as he returned from a visit to a nearby farm, the sky turned quickly from gray to black. The snow reflected what little light remained, but the woods on either side of the road were solid walls of darkness. His breath came in slow, visible puffs, and each step echoed too loudly in his own ears. He felt the old, familiar weight of being watched. Without warning, a low sound drifted through the air, the distant whinny of a horse. It was not the friendly workaday sound of the village animals. It was sharp, echoing, and seemed to come from no single direction. His pace quickened. The sound of hooves followed, slow at first, then gaining speed until they beat a steady rhythm against the frozen road. He dared not turn, but his mind painted the image clearly, a rider approaching at a measured, unstoppable pace. The cold seemed to press tighter around him. The pounding grew louder, so loud that it seemed to fill the air, each strike of hoof like a drumbeat of something inevitable. Then, just as before, the sound stopped completely. The sudden silence was deafening. He forced himself to glance over his shoulder, his heart hammering. The road behind him lay empty in the moonlight, the snow untouched except for his own trail of footprints. Yet the silence felt heavy, almost waiting for him to move again. When he reached the bridge near the churchyard, the air seemed to shift. The mist rose from the snow as if the ground breathed. He could make out the dark outline of the old gravestones, leaning at strange angles. It was here, the villagers had told him, that the horsemen's rides often began, or ended. They claimed that no mortal could pass this spot at night without feeling the weight of the horseman's gaze. He hurried over the bridge, refusing to look at the churchyard. But he could not help noticing that the mist behind him swirled in slow, unnatural spirals, as if stirred by the passing of something unseen. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the black silhouette of a rider, the horse's breath steaming in the cold, the empty space where a head should be. It was not only fear that gripped him now, but a strange, heavy certainty, the feeling that the hollow was drawing him toward something, step by step, night by night. And he knew, though he could not explain why, that if the horseman ever chose to appear before him, he would have no choice but to face him. Winter's grip tightened on Sleepy Hollow, and the valley seemed buried under more than snow. There was a heaviness to the air, a sense that the nights themselves were watching and waiting. The schoolteacher tried to convince himself that the strange sounds and fleeting shadows he had witnessed were no more than tricks of weather and light. Yet in his heart, he knew the hollow had changed him. He no longer felt like an outsider looking in on an old legend. He felt like a thread in the legend itself, winding slowly toward its inevitable knot. It was on a night of biting cold and a thin, sickle-shaped moon that the path finally closed around him. He had stayed later than usual at a gathering in the village. The warmth of the fire and the low hum of voices had kept him from thinking too much about the long ride home. But when he stepped outside, the hollow lay drowned in silver frost. The air was so still that the smoke from the chimneys rose straight into the sky. The snow underfoot glittered faintly, untouched except for the long stretch of road that wound toward the dark silhouette of the churchyard bridge. He mounted his horse and began the journey, his breath and the animals mingling in pale clouds. The woods loomed closer on either side, the branches bending low under the weight of snow, creaking softly in the cold. His own heartbeat felt loud in the silence. For the first mile, nothing stirred. Then came the sound. Faint at first, then rising into the steady rhythm he had come to dread. Hoofbeats. They were behind him, close enough that the vibration seemed to travel through the frozen ground into his bones. He turned in the saddle, and for a moment the road behind him was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. But as he looked, something began to take shape in the mist. A shadow, taller and broader than any man, mounted upon a great black horse that moved with terrifying purpose. The rider's shoulders were hunched, his cloak billowing behind him like wings of darkness. And where a head should have been, there was only emptiness, a hollow above the collar, and in one arm, cradled like a grotesque trophy, the pale, deathly shape of a human head. The schoolteacher's throat tightened, but instinct overcame paralysis. He dug his heels into his horse's sides, and the animal leapt forward, hooves striking the frozen ground in a frantic rhythm. The road twisted ahead, bordered by trees that seemed to close in, their branches reaching like claws. Behind him, the pounding of the other horse grew louder, faster, matching his every desperate stride. The icy wind tore at his face, but he did not dare look back. The snow on the road made each turn treacherous, the hooves slipping dangerously, but still he urged his mount onward. The sound of pursuit was relentless, a drumbeat that refused to fade. Once, against his better judgment, he risked a glance over his shoulder. The horseman was closer now, so close he could see the glint of moonlight on the pale face clutched under his arm. The eyes of that severed head seemed to gleam with an unnatural light, fixed upon him with a gaze that cut deeper than any blade. The bridge was ahead, the narrow wooden crossing over the dark waters near the churchyard. The villagers had always said that the horseman could not cross it, that reaching the far side would mean safety. He fixed his eyes on it, every muscle in his body straining to reach it before the rider closed the distance. The sound of the black horse's hooves was deafening now, the ground seeming to shake with each stride. As he reached the foot of the bridge, his horse stumbled on the icy planks but recovered, charging forward. For a heartbeat, relief surged through him. He was almost across. But then came a movement in the corner of his vision. The horseman rose in his saddle, the severed head lifted high above his shoulder. With a sudden, violent motion, the ghost hurled it forward. It struck with a force that knocked the breath from his lungs. Pain and darkness exploded in his vision. He clung to the saddle, but the world was spinning, the cold biting into his skin as he fell. The last thing he heard was the fading thunder of hooves crossing into the night. When morning came, the villagers found his horse grazing near the churchyard, the saddle empty. On the far side of the bridge lay a battered riding hat, and beside it, shattered in the snow, a smooth, round object that looked far too much like a human skull. The valley returned to its stillness, the frost settling once more over road and field. And somewhere in the mists of Sleepy Hollow, the sound of a lone horseman could still be heard, riding the endless night in search of his lost head. And so, the mists of Sleepy Hollow still drift through the hollow roads at night, carrying whispers of a rider who seeks his missing head. The wind rattles the trees, the bridge creaks, and the darkness seems to breathe. No one knows for certain what became of Ichabod Crane. But when the moon hides behind the clouds and hoofbeats echo through the valley, the villagers close their doors, for the Headless Horseman still rides.